The Cleveland Browns may have already made their decision on Dillon Gabriel. They just haven't said it out loud yet. Because if you listen carefully, not just to what's being said, but how it's being said, something feels off. This isn't what confidence sounds like. This isn't how a team talks about a quarterback they truly believe in long term. Instead, you hear hesitation, careful wording, phrases that leave doors open instead of closing them. And in the NFL, that usually means one thing. A decision has already been made behind the scenes. What makes this situation even colder is that it's not coming from fans or speculation. It's coming from inside the building. Subtle signals, shifting tone, and moves that don't fully match what's being said publicly. And when you start putting all those pieces together, it paints a very different picture. Because this might not be a competition anymore. This might be the early stages of a quiet exit. And what happens next could end Dillon Gabriel's time in Cleveland before it ever really began. It didn't happen all at once, and that's exactly why most people missed it. There was no breaking news, no headline saying the Browns are moving on, nothing dramatic enough to grab attention instantly. Instead, it started quietly, in the tone, in the wording, in the way people inside the organization began talking about Dillon Gabriel. And if you listen closely, it doesn't sound like belief. It sounds like distance. Because when teams believe in a quarterback, especially a young one, they speak with clarity. There's confidence in their voice. There's commitment in their messaging. Even when the player struggles, the language stays strong. He's our guy. We trust him. He just needs time. That's not what's happening here. What you're hearing instead is careful language, phrases that leave room, statements that avoid commitment, words that sound supportive on the surface, but don't actually lock anything in. Things like "he's still in the mix," or "we're evaluating everything." And that might not seem like much at first. But in the NFL, wording matters. Because teams don't accidentally speak this way. Every public comment is controlled. Every statement is intentional. And when that language shifts, even slightly, it usually reflects something deeper happening behind the scenes. And that's exactly what this feels like. Because this isn't how you talk about a quarterback you're building around. This is how you talk about a quarterback you're unsure about. And once that uncertainty creeps in, everything starts to change. Practice reps get evaluated differently. Mistakes feel heavier. Opportunities become shorter. And most importantly, the organization starts preparing for alternatives, even if they haven't admitted it publicly yet. That's the part people overlook. Because by the time fans start debating whether a quarterback is the guy, teams have usually already made that judgment internally. And when you look at what's happening in Cleveland right now, the tone, the hesitation, the lack of clear commitment, it doesn't feel like they're still deciding. It feels like they already have. And this silent shift didn't just come out of nowhere. Because if you go back and look at how this whole situation started, the first real warning sign was there from the very beginning. It just didn't make sense at the time. But now it explains everything. If you really want to understand when this situation started to fall apart, you have to go back to draft day. Because that's where the first real crack showed up. When the Browns selected Dillon Gabriel, the reaction wasn't excitement, it was confusion. Not because he was unknown, but because everyone already knew exactly what he was. A productive college quarterback, smart, efficient, comfortable within structure, but also limited. Undersized, not known for pushing the ball deep, and often described as a system player rather than someone who can take over a game when things break down. And those concerns weren't hidden. They followed him throughout the entire pre-draft process. Scouts talked about them. Analysts pointed them out. Teams built their evaluations around those exact limitations. So when Cleveland used a third-round pick on him, it raised eyebrows immediately, because that kind of investment says you believe in real upside. But then, just a few rounds later, everything changed. The Browns went right back to the same position and selected Shedeur Sanders. And that's when confusion turned into something much bigger. Because teams don't do that. You don't spend a premium mid-round pick on a developmental quarterback and then double back in the same draft to take another one. Not unless you're unsure about the first decision you just made. That's not depth. That's hesitation. That's a front office hedging its bet in real time. And whether they admitted it or not, that second pick completely shifted the situation inside the building. Because now, Gabriel wasn't just a project being developed. He was immediately in competition with someone who offered a completely different profile, more dynamic, more aggressive, and in the eyes of many, a higher ceiling. And once that dynamic is created, it doesn't go away. It lingers. Every practice rep becomes a comparison. Every throw gets judged differently. Every mistake feels bigger because there's someone right behind you who might do it better. And that kind of pressure doesn't take long to show. Because what looked like a normal draft decision on the surface was actually the beginning of something else entirely. A quiet shift in direction. A sign that even in that moment, the Browns weren't fully convinced. And once that doubt enters the picture, especially that early, it doesn't fade. It grows. And it didn't take long for that pressure to turn into something much more real. When the moment finally came, this was supposed to be it. The exact situation every young quarterback waits for. The offense was struggling, the rhythm wasn't there, and the team needed a spark. That door doesn't open easily in the NFL, but when it does, it's your chance to prove you belong. And for Dillon Gabriel, that opportunity arrived sooner than expected. At first glance, it didn't look like a disaster. The stat line wasn't terrible. The touchdown to interception ratio was manageable. On paper, you could convince yourself things were steady. But the problem wasn't what showed up on paper. It was what showed up on the field. Because when you actually watched the games, the offense didn't feel dangerous. It didn't feel threatening. It felt controlled, almost too controlled. Everything stayed short. Safe throws became the default. Checkdowns replaced aggression, and the deeper parts of the field were barely touched. It wasn't that he was making huge mistakes. It was that nothing impactful was happening. And in the NFL, that can be just as damaging. Because defenses adjust quickly. Once they realized there was no real vertical threat, they started tightening coverage underneath. They crowded the short routes, forced longer drives, and made Cleveland earn every single yard the hard way. And that's where things started to fall apart. Because when an offense depends on perfection just to move the ball, even small mistakes become drive killers. One missed read, one slight hesitation, one broken block, and everything stalls. And that's exactly what happened. Drives slowed down, momentum disappeared, and the numbers started reflecting what the eye test already showed. Low yards per attempt, limited explosive plays, an offense that struggled to create anything consistently. This wasn't a quarterback growing into the role. This was a quarterback confirming the concerns that were there from the beginning. And that's the part that matters most. Because teams can be patient with mistakes. They can work through interceptions. They can develop timing. They can fix decision-making. But what's harder to fix is limitation. Because if a quarterback isn't creating pressure on defenses, if he isn't forcing adjustments, if he isn't changing how the game feels, then the ceiling becomes very clear, very quickly. And once a team starts seeing that ceiling, everything shifts. Because now it's no longer about waiting for growth. It's about asking a much harder question. Is this enough? And for the Browns, the answer didn't come from one bad game. It came from a pattern that made them start looking somewhere else. And that's when everything changed. And then everything shifted. Not slowly, not subtly, but in a way you could actually feel. Because while Dillon Gabriel was out, the Browns didn't just replace a quarterback. They introduced a completely different energy into the offense. That's when Shedeur Sanders stepped in. And from the very first few drives, something felt different. The offense didn't look restricted anymore. The ball started moving with intent. There was a willingness to push the field, to challenge defenses instead of just reacting to them. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was aggressive. And that alone changed everything. Because now defenses couldn't just sit back and wait. They had to adjust. They had to respect the possibility of deeper throws, quicker reads, and plays breaking outside of structure. Suddenly, Cleveland wasn't predictable anymore. It was uncomfortable to defend. And that's what stood out. Because even when mistakes happened, even when the interceptions came or timing wasn't fully there, you could still see something that had been missing before. Playmaking. The ability to extend a play. The confidence to take a risk. The presence to control the moment instead of just managing it. And in today's NFL, that matters. Because teams don't just look for safe quarterbacks anymore. They look for upside. They look for players who can create when things break down, who can turn an average play into something dangerous. And Shedeur was showing flashes of exactly that. Not consistently, not fully developed, but enough to make people believe there was something bigger there. And once that belief starts building, it spreads fast. The locker room feels it. The coaches see it. The fans respond to it. And most importantly, the organization starts thinking differently. Because now, it's no longer just about what you have. It's about what you could have. And that's where things become difficult for someone like Gabriel. Because once a team starts seeing a higher ceiling in another player, it changes how they evaluate everything else. The comparison becomes unavoidable. Every rep, every game, every decision gets viewed through that new lens. And over time, that gap starts to grow. By the end, this didn't feel like a temporary switch anymore. It didn't feel like a situation where the job was waiting for someone to come back and reclaim it. It felt like something had already been taken. And not because of one moment, but because of what kept showing up over and over again. Because while one quarterback was managing the game, the other was trying to take control of it. And in a league built on upside, that difference changes everything. And this is where the situation stops being about performance and starts being about signals. Because while Shedeur Sanders was building momentum on the field, something just as important was happening behind the scenes. The way the Browns were talking about Dillon Gabriel completely changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. There were no strong endorsements anymore, no statements that locked him in as the future. Instead, what started coming out of the organization sounded cautious, controlled. Phrases like, "He's still part of the plans for now," began to show up. And that "for now" says everything. Because that's not how teams talk about a quarterback they believe in. That's how they talk about someone they're not ready to fully commit to, someone they might need to move on from if a better option appears. And it didn't stop there. There were growing reports, and again, nothing officially confirmed, but definitely being talked about, that Cleveland was already exploring other quarterback options. Not as a long-term idea, but as something immediate. Draft conversations. New names entering discussions. Evaluations shifting toward different profiles. And once that starts happening, the message becomes hard to ignore. Because teams don't look for replacements this early, unless they've already lost confidence. This isn't about patience anymore. It's not about giving Gabriel time to develop or waiting for things to click. It's about preparing for what comes next. And that's what makes this situation so telling. Because by the time the outside world starts questioning a quarterback, the decision inside the building has usually already been made. And everything we're seeing right now, the tone, the language, the direction, points to that exact moment. A quiet decision, one that hasn't been announced, but is already shaping everything around it. Even the way leadership is handling the situation feels intentional. No harsh criticism, no direct statements, just careful wording that avoids commitment. And that's not random, that's strategy. Because when teams start talking like this, they're not just evaluating, they're protecting flexibility, keeping options open, making sure they can pivot without creating unnecessary noise or damaging potential trade value. And in the NFL, once it reaches that stage, the clock is already ticking. Because at that point, it's no longer about whether a change is coming. It's about when it becomes official. And judging by everything happening in Cleveland right now, that moment might be closer than anyone thinks. And if the front office was being careful with its words, the coaching staff didn't hide it quite as well. Because when the new head coach addressed the quarterback situation, the answer sounded safe on the surface, almost too safe. He called it an open competition. He said no one has separated themselves. He emphasized that everything would be decided based on what shows up on film. Standard language, the kind of response you expect when a team doesn't want to commit too early. But when you actually break that down, it hits very differently. Because open competition only works when everyone is starting from the same place. And that's not what this is. When a coach says nobody has done enough to separate themselves, that doesn't land equally across the room. It lands hardest on the quarterback who already had his opportunity, the one who was given the chance to prove himself and didn't fully take it. That lands on Dillon Gabriel. And that's what makes this so telling. Because that statement wasn't a reset. It was a quiet admission, a way of saying the tape wasn't convincing enough to lock anything in. And in the NFL, once trust starts to slip, it's almost impossible to rebuild it completely. But the shift didn't stop with the coaching staff. Because around the team, media voices began changing their tone too. Insiders weren't dancing around the situation anymore. They weren't framing Gabriel as a long-term piece or a developing starter. Instead, the conversation became more direct, sharper, more honest. And when depth charts started being discussed publicly, the picture became even clearer. At the top, you had Shedeur Sanders still developing, still inconsistent, but clearly the most intriguing option. The one with upside, the one the organization is actively watching. Then you had Deshaun Watson, still part of the equation because of experience and contract reality, whether people like it or not. And then, you had Gabriel, not as the future, not even as the main competition, but as the extra piece, the name that stays relevant only if something else goes wrong. And that's a dangerous place to be. Because once a quarterback falls into that category this early in his career, the situation changes fast. Now you're not just fighting to start, you're fighting to stay. And what makes it even more telling is how little resistance there is to that idea. There's no strong push from coaches trying to reshape the narrative. No consistent defense from insiders trying to bring the conversation back in his favor. Mostly it's silence. And in the NFL, silence can be louder than criticism. Because when a team truly believes in a young quarterback, they protect him. They control the narrative. They make sure doubt doesn't spread. That's not happening here. If anything, the doubt is growing. And once it reaches this point, there's only one direction things usually go. And this is where everything becomes simple and brutal. Because at a certain point, this stops being about opinions, performance, or even potential. It becomes about numbers. Roster numbers. And in the NFL, numbers don't lie and they don't care. Because you can't carry everyone. You can't walk into training camp with 4 quarterbacks all needing reps, all needing development, all expecting a real shot. That's how confusion starts. That's how teams lose direction. And it's exactly the kind of situation Cleveland has already dealt with before and failed. They're not going down that road again. This time, the plan is clear. Identify your top 2 early. Give them the reps. Build the offense around that structure. Which means one thing. Someone is getting left out. Now look at the situation realistically. Shedeur Sanders isn't going anywhere. He's the upside play, the one the organization is clearly interested in building around, the player who brought life back into the offense. Deshaun Watson, whether people like it or not, is tied to the team financially. His contract alone keeps him in the picture. That's not something the Browns can just move away from overnight. And if the Browns bring in another quarterback, which reports suggest is very much on the table, that's a new investment. A player the coaching staff selects specifically for their system. Someone they want to develop from the ground up. So where does that leave Dillon Gabriel? Right in the middle of a situation he can't win. Because once that new name enters the room, he doesn't become competition. He becomes expendable. The extra piece. The easiest decision. And that's how fast things shift in this league. Because when a team reaches this point, moves happen quickly. Trade calls start happening. Options get explored. And if nothing materializes, releases come even faster than people expect. What makes this even tougher is the timing. This isn't happening after years of evaluation. This isn't a slow decline where a player gradually loses his role. This is happening almost immediately. One short stretch of games, and now his future is already in question. And everyone inside that building knows it. They understand what adding another quarterback means. They understand how the depth chart works, and they understand that once that decision is made, there's no going back. No second chances. No extended timeline. No waiting to see what could happen. At that point, it's not a competition anymore. It's a replacement. And the deeper you look at this situation, the harder it becomes to see it as just a Dillon Gabriel problem. Because this has happened before. Not with the exact same names, but with the same outcome. Draft a quarterback. Convince everyone this one might be different. Give him a short window. Watch things fall apart. Reset. And then do it all over again. That's been the cycle. And what makes this situation feel heavier is that it doesn't look like an exception. It looks like another chapter in that same pattern. Because even now, you can see the same warning signs. Uncertainty in evaluation. Mixed signals in decision-making. Investing in one quarterback, then immediately hedging with another. That's not a clear plan. That's a reaction. A team trying to fix a problem quickly instead of building something stable over time. And while all of this is happening on the offensive side, there's another reality the Browns can't ignore. Their defense is ready. This is a unit that can compete with anyone. Fast, physical, disciplined. The kind of group that gives you a real chance to win games if the offense simply does its part. But that's been the issue. The offense hasn't held up its side. And in the NFL, those windows don't stay open forever. Defensive cores age. Contracts expire. Momentum fades. And if the quarterback situation isn't solved before that window closes, everything resets again. Another rebuild. Another missed opportunity. Another what if. That's what makes this moment so critical. Because it's not just about finding a quarterback anymore. It's about breaking a cycle. And right now, it doesn't look like that's happening. Because instead of clarity, there's still confusion. Instead of commitment, there's hesitation. Instead of stability, there's another situation where the team is already looking for the next answer before fully committing to the current one. And that's dangerous. Because when a franchise keeps repeating the same pattern, it becomes harder and harder to believe the outcome will change. Which brings everything back to where we are now. Because this isn't just about whether Dillon Gabriel succeeds or fails. It's about whether the Browns finally get this right, or fall into the exact same situation all over again. And when you put everything together, it starts to feel less like a situation that's still developing and more like one that's already decided. The tone has changed. The opportunities have shifted. The direction is becoming clearer with every move. This isn't about waiting anymore. It's about timing. Because in the NFL, the real decisions are made long before they're announced. And right now, everything coming out of Cleveland points to the same reality. They're preparing for a future that doesn't include Dillon Gabriel. Not loudly, not officially, but unmistakably. And now it all comes down to one moment. Draft day. Because the second the Browns make their next move at quarterback, everything becomes final. No more speculation, no more debate. Just confirmation. And if things go the way they're trending, this won't be remembered as a competition. It'll be remembered as the moment Cleveland quietly moved on, before most people even realized it happened.